Hello, everybody, and welcome to Truth Be Told. I am Micah Gunn, and I'm joined by a very special guest today, Mr. Walt Heyer. Mr. Heyer, would you introduce yourself to all of our listeners today?
Yeah, hi, I'm Walt Heyer, the founder of website sexchangeregret.com. And I've been working with detransitioners for the last 12 or so years, and I detransitioned 30 years ago.
Your website is so well put together, by the way. I've gone through it, studied into all the work you do. You do incredible work, so thank you for all that you do for people that are struggling with transgenderism. And I'm just really impressed by everything you do, and as well as the story that you have. Would you mind going through kind of your story and how you got to this point in life?
Sure. Yeah, it started actually in 1944, so that seems kind of incredible that it goes back that long. So I sit here, I'm 80 years old, and so I've been dealing with this on some level for 76 years. So I don't come from a position of just an onlooker. I've been dealing with it when my grandmother cross-dressed me at the age of 4 because I was curious about girls' clothing. She was a seamstress, and she told me how cute I looked and how wonderful I looked as a little girl. Well, it takes a long time to become mature enough to understand when any adult puts a young boy in a dress and tells him how cute he looks, that you're causing psychological, emotional, and sometimes sexual damage because you start to wonder, what's wrong with me? And I think that's kind of the real issue at stake for young people. When people affirm them in a different gender, what you're really telling them is that there's something wrong with you the way you are and that you need to change and become somebody else. That's pretty horrifying for a young boy to deal with. And so as a result of the purple dress grandma made me, my dad, when he found out about it, became very angry and was trying to sort of shape me into the man that he was. A part-time police officer, a judo expert, a big guy, really likable guy. And but he took to disciplining me because he was, this is in the mid 1940s, and disciplining me harshly to try to shape me like you would a blacksmith with iron, through the fire, and shape him into what you expect it to be. So, and then his brother, who was an adopted brother, when he found out that I'd been wearing a dress, he decided that I was fair game to be sexually molested. So I had the purple dress, the harsh discipline, and sexual molestations before I was 9 years old. So all these things together cause you to not really think that life is going to go real well for you, and that there must be something wrong with you because they're hitting you with hardwood floor planks, they're sexually molesting you and put you in a dress. So if you realize what's going on in a young person's mind, it's very confusing. So and it wasn't until the mid 1950s, about 10 years later, that I realized there was a term for this. And it was the newspapers had Christine Jorgensen, the first Marine or soldier to become a female. And they changed Christine Jorgensen's gender. That was a big deal. And then I saw that in the headlines. Well, maybe that's me. I was never homosexual. I never had that as an issue. And that, quite honestly, is a good point to mention, that 90% of the people that I work with and have worked with are heterosexual men that never engaged in homosexuality. So identifying as a transgender is not necessarily a homosexual issue. I can tell you that the people we hear about, the drag queens, however, are all homosexual. That's kind of the homosexual quarters of the transgender movement, are the drag queens. But so, as I went through life, I was in high school, played football, ran track. I was a little guy. I'm still a little guy as far as that goes. But, I was trying to deal with what had happened. And I had no ability to understand what you do with being put in a dress. I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't understand why I got all this discipline. I couldn't understand why I was being sexually abused by my uncle. I mean, I didn't have all this information, really. It didn't really become clear to me until really when I was like 42, went and had surgery and became Laura Jensen female. And it was during that process of sort of, I was studying to be a psychologist at UC Santa Cruz and started reading books on psychology. And then all these things started opening up to me. I'm going, oh, people who are sexually abused or physically abused and emotionally abused when you put a boy in a dress, that's emotional abuse.
Right.
So I had the three components going in, and I go, well, no wonder I had difficulty. No one had the wisdom or the understanding or the knowledge that these things were harmful to young people. Today we know that. The problem with today is that they ignore it, and they won't acknowledge it, and they won't treat it. It's different. Every one of the people that I've worked with, which are hundreds, literally hundreds, probably over 1,000, have been able to tell me what happened to them as a young person that caused them to not like who they are. And that was the moment they decided that they would be better off if they changed genders. And so in uncovering that what happened issue is they can go back then and sort of deal with that issue, and then it helps them detransition. And that's what helped me 35 years ago. You realize, no, I didn't need to, cut off body parts. I didn't need to identify. I just needed to deal with the fact that I had a lot of trauma and I had a lot of abuse in my life, and I need to deal with that so that I can actually pull myself back together, put the pieces back together in my life, and begin to live that out. So for over 30 years, since January 1990, I've been able to stand up and chew gum and talk and walk at the same time instead of dealing with this crazy nonsense about becoming someone else, which, by the way, no one has ever changed from a man to a woman or a woman to a man except, socially, but you don't do it biologically, you don't do it medically, and you don't do it scientifically or biologically. It's all just sort of this cosmetic, sort of like Mardi Gras, Halloween costume that you put on. And some of it's very effective in terms of how it looks. It looks very convincing. But the fact of the matter is, biologically, you're still a man.
Would you be able to talk more? You mentioned your grandmother and your father as well, being caregivers to you. They have a huge responsibility in how a child grows up. What's advice you could give a caregiver?
Well, yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the people who are struggling. And I immediately, when you said that, thought about it's actually oftentimes something outside of the home or the caregiver themselves that's actually causing them to struggle. So it's not something they were born with. So
Right.
You start to find out what caused this. And one of the things that I do when I work with people, I just worked with a 13-year-old girl who started identifying as a boy at 10 years old. And through the mother and through some emails, I just ask her the simple question, and I think parents can do this too. Why do you want to destroy who you are? That's such an important question because, there's something about the idea of becoming someone else. You have to destroy who you are. So I look at transgenderism not as trying to become someone else, but actually I look at the transgender ideology as a self-destructive behavior because you're actually destroying who you really are in an attempt to become someone who you can never really be. And so biologically, you're correct the way you were came out of the womb. Medically, you're correct the way you came out of the womb. But maybe something happened to you psychologically or emotionally or sexually that caused you to be confused about who you are. So that doesn't change your biology. It just changed the way you think about yourself. So I think parents need to be fully aware of what kind of dialogue do they have. Caregivers too, are they having with their children? Are they talking about you can change genders and showing them things on television? Because there's so much stuff on television about, kids changing genders or adults. And, we're getting annihilated by all of this absolute brainwashing stuff about people changing genders. And I think we're better off if we go back and realize that it's harmful to do this. And it's harmful to identify children in a different gender. It's harmful to say, oh, you must be transgender, so you, Johnny, you can wear a dress and go to school as Judy. That's harmful.
Right.
These are harmful things. You know, they may be real politically correct. It may seem like you're bright or brighter than other people as a parent because you have a transgender child. No, you're causing your child some kind of emotional, psychological, sexual, or even social abuse. And the consequences, unfortunately, look at me in my own life. I didn't realize all of this damage until I was 50 years old. So 46 years that I suffered and was cut on, given hormones, all these things happened to me totally unnecessarily. Did I have gender dysphoria? You know, they diagnosed me with gender dysphoria, but, you know, they diagnose anybody with gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
I have made the comment, if you put a rock in front of one of these gender clinics and tell them, this rock tells me it has gender dysphoria, they will say, oh, yeah, it definitely does, because they will diagnose anything and everyone with gender dysphoria. I have done some deep research on this, and you cannot get a non-gender dysphoria diagnosis in a gender clinic. Everybody is diagnosed with gender dysphoria. I mean, that should tell us something really strange is not right in the clinics.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that too, I think it begs the question, what then does someone struggling with this do? Because if they go to if someone just types into Google, I am struggling with transgenderism or gender dysphoria, I'm struggling with this, they're probably going to be linked to a lot of these gender clinics. So what then would you recommend? How would you go about instructing someone, here's where you go, here's how you find help?
Yeah, well, a doctor wrote me one time, and he said, whatever you do, if you get anywhere near a gender clinic and you're struggling, run the other way as fast as you can for as long as you can and get as far away as you can, because you're not going to get the help you need. And that came from a doctor.
Wow.
So I think what's instructive here is to find a therapist who is willing to look at things like body dysmorphia or depression, dissociative disorders, bipolar disorder, sexual abuse. My thesis on this, and this is what I've explained, if a child has ever been sexually abused, ever been emotionally abused or put through trauma, they are not candidates for hormone therapy and a gender change. If something has happened to this child, or even an adult situation where they manifest itself later in life, you know, there's something that happened, and that's what needs to be talked about. And that's the kind of work that I do. I actually spend time with these people and ask, tell me what happened to you. I was working with a guy, as an example, who's in his 40s, who changed genders. He's got regret. We're going back and forth just like you and I are today. And I said, why did you do this? What caused you to do this? I just so interested. And he said, I don't know. I said, well, let's go back and walk through your childhood and the things that happened. And he went through this, and he was 11 years old at a summer camp with a swimming team, and the swimming coach took him in the shower room and sexually molested him when no one else was around. And I said, well, how soon after that did you decide that you were suffering from some kind of displeasure with who you were? And he stopped and paused. He says, oh my gosh, right after that. So this, in his case, it was being sexually abused at 11. So, but no one ever talked about that. And that's why in my view, it's so important to put this message out. If you've been sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally abused, hurt, you're confused, you don't have gender dysphoria. You've got some trauma, something that happened. You know, maybe I had one young person who had been passed around to 7 foster homes, and he just felt like nobody wanted me. He felt like he was just on the scrap heap of life. The only way that he felt he could sort of recognize, or get people to recognize him or see him differently, was to change genders. Not that he didn't really have gender dysphoria, he just wanted to be noticed. And so these are important things to deal with. And even this young girl that I worked with, when she, the 13-year-old, when we went through this, and I said, "What caused you to do this?" And she stopped for a minute. She said, "I had a bad dad." 13 years old. "I had a bad dad." "What does that mean?" And she says, "Dad hurt me a lot. And I didn't like being hurt by my dad. I didn't want that to happen." So in her mind, she actually said, "I thought if I became identified as a man, Dad would not want to hurt me anymore." So it wasn't about being a transgender. It wasn't about gender dysphoria. And I've heard this, I would say, honestly, 40 to 50% of the time, children and even sometimes in adults a girl will identify as a boy to protect themselves against being sexually abused. They feel like they're unattractive to the person who's harming them. They want to become unattractive to them so that they don't touch them. So it becomes a defense mechanism against being abused. And for a young boy, he thinks, if I get rid of my genitalia, then the people who are molesting me and touching me there, they won't want to do that anymore because I don't have genitalia. So it's really not about being transgender. It's about protecting themselves because no one else is protecting them. They're trying to find a way to protect themselves from being sexually abused. And when you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. In the mind of a young person who's being abused and no one's protecting them, an adult is doing it, they just want to stop. And the person wouldn't stop unless I change so radically that I become unattractive to them. And in many cases, this is what's happening with young boys and girls who identify as a different gender, by just being unattractive.
And it's so sad to realize that these people that are struggling with these things that have happened to them, these are hard topics to bring up, even to people close to you, people that you love. I know there's a lot of embarrassment and shame felt by these people who have, been sexually molested or even raped, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so hard for them to bring up these things. But if they don't, then the alternative can be so much more harmful to themselves by, going as far as surgery or just living a life that they're so miserable in. And I just find that so sad.
And I think, and I'll do a cheap little plug on my book, but it's really a good book, Trans Life Survivors, because it talks about, I took emails and changed their name and their location and all that stuff. Sure. But I let them tell their story. And so you can see what happened to these individuals in the book, Trans Life Survivors. They're all true stories. And, even in the case of a girl who became a boy, and she became the head of a gender clinic in an area, but no one ever dealt with what happened to her. No one ever addressed what happened to her as a young child. Even as she was affirmed, living the life of a lesbian woman in a gender clinic environment, a hero in the neighborhood, she committed suicide. And her friend said she was always depressed. Nobody ever dealt with her depression. And everybody's trying to fix depression with hormones and a gender change. Sorry, it doesn't work. And so I think it's so important to do that. If people also want to see the history and how this whole thing got started, the book Paper Genders is a book that I wrote. It really gives this story. And it was started by three men, John Money, Benjamin, and a couple of others that were pedophile activists. They were pedophiles. So the origin of transgender identities comes out of pedophilia, not out of trying to correct something that was wrong with a child in the womb. They were fine in the womb, and when they came out, it was what happened to them in society or by a parent or by somebody else that caused them to have this difficulty. It is horrible.
It's such a good thing that you do, though, connecting with a lot of these people on such a personal level, especially as someone who's been through this yourself, realizing the difficulties, realizing the struggles, but being so open and honest with not just people struggling with transgenderism or dysphoria issues, but also people like me who aren't as knowledgeable about the subject itself. I think it's incredibly helpful. What then would you say to people who are against the idea that this is, so I guess What I'm trying to say is there are people who, if you were to approach them and they have struggled with this in the past, they will push back at you saying, no, this is how I am, or this is not a mental struggle. This is not from trauma. They would push at you.
Yeah.
Besides your testimony
Hmm.
of all the people you've worked with saying that they can point to parts of their life that has caused this to happen,
Hmm.
what's your message to them?
Yeah. Well, it's usually I'm glad that it's working for you. And if it eventually doesn't work for you, just know that I'm here for you. What I do know is that the regret usually sets in between 8 and 20 years, but it can be as early as 3 weeks to 30 years. So
Wow.
the scope of this is pretty broad. I mean, I had an interesting situation where a guy wrote me an email 4 or 5 years ago, and he's take down your website. You're an idiot. You don't. And he went on, and he said, I hate you. And I said, okay. I said, I understand you have a different point of view. It's all right to have. I'm good with that.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote me probably every 3 months or so for 2 or 3 years. And I was always kind to him in my response. And I said, look, I totally understand. You're doing fine and everything's good. Uh, I'm happy for you. He wrote one near Thanksgiving about 3 years ago, I guess it was. He wrote me and said, hey, I'm the guy who's been writing you. Can you help me detransition?
Wow.
So, I always look at it like it's just not for you. It just hasn't happened yet. And so I do know there's a cases where people will live out this life identifying in a different gender, and many of those cases are what's known as, probably a term you haven't heard much before, is called autogynephilia. Autogynephilia is where typically men, but some women too, will dress up in women's clothing, and they become the object of their own sexual affection. In other words, that is their mode of arousal. That is their mode of sexual intercourse, if I can say that, so that they are fully satisfied with life alone, cross-dressing. They may have friends, but they are sexually gratified by wearing women's clothes. They look in the mirror, and when they look in the mirror, they see the object of their affection. And so this is a mental disorder, but people can live out their life with that mental disorder because it's gratifying to them to do. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't, if someone wanted to, treat that and deal with it. But there's other things like transvestic fetish disorder, where people become aroused by a certain piece of clothing, and rather than say that I have a transvestic fetish disorder, they will say I'm a transgender, because running around and saying I have a transvestic fetish disorder is not as appealing to your friends as it is to say I'm a transgender, right? So, and then we have people who are simply cross-dressers that will identify as transgender. They're really not. Or they're transvestite, will identify as a transgender. So there's a lot of categories within this umbrella that covers so many things. But what I think is so important is these are all really good people, that something bad happened to them, something so out of the norm that they didn't know how to deal with it properly. No one helped them focus on what it was that happened to them. But what we have today is now everybody is just feeding them this affirmation, feeding them hormones. And hormones are like heroin. I mean, really, they're powerful steroids. They do calm you down. They will make you feel and behave differently. So you think you're getting better. The problem is that there's a period of time where they will wear off. And all of a sudden you wake up and you go, this is really not working anymore. I'm really not happy with this nonsense, and I want my life back. I'm working with somebody right now who they started in the late 90s. They transitioned at, I think, 2009, and now they're detransitioning. I'm going to speak with them tomorrow. And so I get these cases all the time, and many of them are usually 5, 10, 15 years, but they're all over the place, and they're men and women. And so I think it's important for us to realize that we're doing a great deal of harm by stuffing hormones into men and women and then telling them they're going to become someone else when they really can't. And I need for people out there to hear this. If there's a female out there who's considering taking hormones, whatever you do, don't do it. I can tell you that if you end up at that point of regret, which I have a lot of gals do that, the devastation that testosterone does to women is irreversible. You know, they will look like men, their voices will sound like men, and that becomes so devastating to them, even more so. I mean, the guys who become girls detransition better. It takes about 2 years for them to sort of walk their way back. The poor females who become males, when they detransition, sorry, they have a beard, and even getting rid of the beard ends up scarring their skin sometimes. So this is just not good stuff. I want the people to have good, happy, healthy lives, but taking hormones and cutting off body parts is not the way to do it.
I think this issue can become kind of taboo in churches, which can be harmful to people struggling because they need to come forward. They need to talk to somebody. And church should be a place where that could be, that should be able to be brought up and they could find help. Not all the help they need, but at least a foothold. So what advice would you give to Christians in churches who are maybe ashamed of struggling with this, not wanting to tell people, and also churches who don't want to affirm this behavior, don't want to say that it's okay, but want to be open to accepting people that are struggling with this and also helping them to detransition if they've transitioned or stop them from transitioning? What would your advice be to churches or Christians struggling?
Yeah, well, anybody struggling with these identity issues need to be in church. And they need to have a pastoral staff that is willing to sit down with them and do just like we were talking about today. I'm going to speak at a church in a week and a half about these very issues. And so I think if we can get leadership in a church, and many of the churches will have somebody who attends there that's a PhD psychologist, or they have somebody on staff that's real good at counseling. And I think if we can just get them to sit down, and I've said this time and time again, sit down with a cup of coffee and don't make it clinical. Say, just tell me what happened to you. See, that's my whole thesis here. What happened to you that caused you to not like who you are? Because we know the Lord Jesus Christ loves you. And we know that he does not want you to engage in self-destructive behavior. And we also know that the way to salvation is to honor and glorify Jesus Christ. And you can't do that by destroying your body and identifying by somebody who God didn't make. And so, there's a lot of glory through Christ in finding who you are and finding out where that pain is. And so I think if we just can get to that point where we understand honoring and glorifying Jesus Christ is actually finding our way back, finding out what caused the hurt and what caused the pain. And a good pastoral staff can do that. I was the director of care ministries in a large church with about 70 on staff. And with the counseling ministries, I was able to do these things. But I wanted to go bigger. I left the church so that I could work worldwide and work with people all over the world instead of just a few a day. I can work now with thousands a day. So I think it's important for the church to realize they weren't born that way. God didn't make them that way. We need to love on them, but we also need to help guide them to understand something happened to them and then show them that honoring and glorifying Jesus Christ is admitting that cutting off body parts and taking hormones does not honor and glorifying Jesus Christ, but admitting you're wrong and confessing it was a sin to do and having the Lord redeem and restore your life. That's the glory. And that's where you'll come in line with the Holy Spirit and live the life that God intended you to live.
Thank you all so much for joining us today on Truth Be Told. If you are struggling with this or you know somebody's struggling with this, I really hope that you take these words into consideration today and know that you have a church that loves you, you have a God that loves you, and that there's a way back. If you're struggling with this, there's a way back. Even if you've gone all the way and transitioned, there is a way back. So please find somebody to talk to, and I hope you find these words encouraging. Until next time, keep on reading your Bibles and keep on thinking critically about them. Thanks, guys.